Hello again. You're on Office Hours with the Mad Professor. My name is Liam. This evening's discussion is a meditation on the long-term use of propaganda in justifying political authority, in underlying it's being the very foundations for political authority. Why do people trust particular leaders? Why should you turn to a given leader? To do that, I'm going to make some points about ancient Mesopotamia, of all places, and use that to show the development of the core technique, and then I'll bring that back around to the contemporary period and show why this is remotely relevant, how we can still see the same techniques being played out and how they play upon human psychology. So, let's start with a brief historical sketch of kingship in Mesopotamia prior to the rise of what I'll call heroic kingship. Originally, kings had a sacral role in Mesopotamian culture. They served a particular religious function. They were simultaneously a chief administrative officer and also a high priest. So they oversaw the temple hierarchy. They communicated with the chief god of the city and helped to maintain a decent living environment, helped to basically buy off the gods so they didn't destroy things. Mesopotamia was a very complex and difficult place to live, and the relationship between people and the gods was generally one of abject terror. The king played a role in helping to protect the people by overseeing the rituals that kept them safe from the gods. You can see a bit of both sides of this administrative and religious role as far back as the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerians, later passed to the Akkadians and all later peoples of the area, because Gilgamesh starts off as a particularly awful king and yet learns over the course of his adventures what he needs to do in order to properly fulfill his function, what his particular duty is. And there's a core lesson there for later political rulers, that of legacy. The importance of presenting a good image to posterity. Gilgamesh recognizes over the course of his adventures that all people will die, that he will die. And he laments this fact initially and goes off seeking a way to find immortality, realizing that he cannot achieve immortality himself directly. He can achieve it of a sort through legacy, through being remembered well. And the story ends with him going back to his city and overseeing reconstruction of the walls to further protect the city and thereby be a good king to his people. This is the beginning of a shift in emphasis on kingship and the relationship to larger numbers of people. The more the population goes up, the more you need to introduce political techniques to control the population, to convince them to accept your authority. I mean, in earlier tribal life amongst hunter-gatherers, this is not really the same. You don't have the same sort of dynamics here. Smaller bands of people, 50, 150 people at most. When you have 5,000, 10,000 people living in a city, you need to develop a lot more political sophistication. This is one of many steps toward that. Now, jumping forward a bit time-wise, we have the figure of Sargon of Akkad, often held up as the first conquering emperor in human history. Sargon was not the first person to try to conquer additional city-states in Mesopotamia and link them together into a single cohesive state. A few people before him had tried, like Lugal-Zaggisi had tried, but they could not pull this off. They didn't manage to develop enough the particular techniques needed to control a larger state. Sargon is the first person to manage to not only conquer wide swaths of territory, but successfully to pass it to heirs over more than one generation. And he will be remembered for a very, very long time in the region because of this. 1,600 years later, in the Neo-Assyrian period, the rulers were still rebuilding sites and renewing the dedications and praising Sargon as sort of the founder of the very idea of a conquering empire, sort of acknowledging his unique genius here. Now, you'd be justified in asking what made this long memory possible. Well, that comes along with the invention of writing. Writing was not initially created for anything like this. This wasn't created for myths, for political purposes. It had a very pragmatic function initially. It affected the records about the storage of grains so you could survive winters. It helped with long-distance trade. There was a ton of practical reasons it developed, but once it existed, people found political uses for it very quickly. And stories about these earlier rulers were communicated to posterity because they left behind monuments with their stories on them. And later generations read these and said, these guys must have been great because they left behind these monuments. And that starts the whole process of using propaganda to control populations. Now, Sargon also introduces an interesting concept that I will call heroic kingship. The earlier understanding of kings was, again, sacral. It had a primarily religious function paired to an administrative function because the temple played a key role in the economy. The temples used to oversee the entire economic structure, the distribution of grain and resources to people. It wasn't just a sort of free-for-all. The food came in to central storage underneath the priests and was distributed out to people over the course of the year. The king oversaw that whole process. What sets Sargon apart is the specific stories about him, the attempt to kind of propagandize him, to make him somehow better or greater than others. He didn't simply stand in for the gods, he was a kind of heroic figure himself. You can see some of this in origin stories attributed to him. In a story later echoed by the Moses tale, Sargon was originally abandoned, placed into a reed basket, floated down the river, and was found and raised in an adopted family. And he was raised in an adoptive family that was tied to the royal family of the city-state of Kish. Sargon would later rise to power within the royal court in Kish, but was, of course, not of the royal line himself. But he was ambitious, he was smart, and he bided his time until he could overthrow the king and seize power for himself, which he did. And having done so, he became the king of Kish, then reached out to begin taking other city-states. And in doing that, in taking each one, he claimed to be the better king for them, the legitimate king, not because he had some claim to antiquity in the area, not because he had some claim to the representation of their particular gods, but because he had conquered them. He claimed that, I'm a better king because I defeated you. It's an interesting sort of circular logic, but if you think about it, he clearly had demonstrated that he was a better warrior king than their king, that he was a superior strategist, that he knew what he was doing in conquest. Therefore, he would better be able to protect you from other people who would seek to do this. So, his abilities as a conquering warrior are what makes him the king. Now, heroic kingship itself, that idea of kings fighting in battle, that's not really common anymore. We don't see presidents leading troops in battle anymore. That stopped a long time ago. But the propaganda that underlie the entire thing, the propaganda talking about his conquest, talking about him personally, showing what a badass Sargon was, that's the key significance of all of this. Ever since the time of Sargon, states have been using this kind of political propaganda to create, a leader cult, to talk up how important the leader is. This is picked up as a political lesson by all the later Mesopotamian peoples. It's adopted by tons of peoples in the immediate regional context, by peoples in the Iranian plateau, by peoples to the west in the Levant. It's communicated from that point on and sort of spread around. So we can still see echoes of it throughout time. Think about the modern world for a moment. How do we treat presidents here? Think about monuments to important presidents. right? From more abstract monuments like the Washington Monument to very direct ones like the Lincoln Memorial, or the one to FDR, where you've got your big statues, phrases from them, quotes, tales of their accomplishments, sort of inscribed in stone, left behind. That's a deliberate nod to antiquity. It's using very similar tactics that the ancient world used, but we do tons of other things as well. Another idea that draws in from the ancient world, look at currency. Coins, once coinage had been developed by the Lydians in about the 7th century BCE, the idea quickly spreads from that point, and you can see currency stamped with the likeness of the ruler and the name of the ruler in particular areas. Now, they'll eventually standardize weights and whatnot for international exchange, but you're going to see ruler likenesses on these different coins for a reason. They serve a propagandistic function. They show our state is powerful enough and rich enough that we can mint our own gold and silver coins and not have to depend upon other people's and other people's coins. It's showing the power of the state. You see something similar in monolithic construction all over the place. Why did people build great things in antiquity? Why do they continue to build things today? Why do we name things for people? It's an attempt to draw on the power of this individual and to communicate their significance to posterity, to build a legacy for them in the popular imagination. All of that is used to reinforce the power of the state as a whole, the legitimacy of the government, the power of the government. We are not monarchies anymore, but the idea of heroic kingship very much still exists. We still hold up kings and we look to the most important presidents, the more significant presidents in American history, and we talk about their accomplishments and we make kids learn about them in elementary school and high school while they're being sort of indoctrinated into the core myths of what it means to be American. They learn about these key presidents and their accomplishments. Now, people in the free world have a justifiable sense of superiority to peoples who live in dictatorships. Just look at the terminology, the free world. We tend to point to our constitutional freedoms, the limitations on arbitrary executive power within our states, and we think, we're so much better off. We are a free people. This is a free country and a free society. The United States is clearly not like North Korea. Right? Living in the United States is clearly easier in many ways than living in North Korea. And there's often a sense of, subtle derision towards the kind of leader cult that people put up for the North Korean leader. I mean, people still spread ridiculous stories within the country about him. He doesn't go to the bathroom, weird stories like that. They try to, essentially deify the local ruler as a way of ensuring the power of the ruler, the undisputed authority of the ruler, and the legitimacy of the dynasty itself. That's relatively uncommon in the modern world. But the leader cult is very much alive, and the valorization of leaders continues. I pointed to the way that we teach young children about presidents. Well, what's the point of talking about old presidents if not to show people why we should respect the current presidents, why you should always continue to acknowledge the leadership and the leader role of the president. There is an implicit bias there towards executive power, toward acknowledging the legitimacy of the government, to essentially guaranteeing the hegemony on a kind of mental level here of the state itself. And it does that through a propaganda model. That's in part what education really does in the first place. Everything from currency to television broadcasts talking about the government and respecting the office of the presidency, to certain laws, the Pledge of Allegiance, all these sort of things that we kind of take as simple and innocuous. In some ways they are, but they do reinforce the acknowledgement of a central authority figure. Now, regardless of whether you think executive power is a good thing or a bad thing, there are people who think that we naturally need powerful executive figures. They still have that kind of respect for the authority of kings, and they just simply translate that into the modern world. That's fine. There are plenty of people who think that you don't need that at all. I'm not getting into that question whatsoever in this discussion. The point here is simply to acknowledge that that exists, that there is an attempt to create a kind of leader cult, basically a powerful figurehead at the top of the nation who is here to protect you, to guarantee your safety, whose actions should not be questioned. Just, again, you can pull examples from all the modern presidencies here. We have had an effectively imperial presidency since the time of Lincoln, so I'm not trying to pick on Trump in particular, but he is the current president. Think about statements like Stephen Miller's on television a few months ago, the president's authority will not be questioned, or arguments recently by Rudy Giuliani that suggest that a president cannot be indicted for any kind of crimes. He absolutely has legal immunity during the time that he is in office. Never mind, again, that's a flip from Giuliani's perspective on the matter, in the past. That's, again, not the matter. The question here, I'm not trying to talk about modern politics. I'm simply trying to talk about the way that people still look at leadership today, and to connect this to the long-term development of a propaganda model of government, which specifically seeks to inculcate a sense of obedience, a sense of locked-in hierarchy. You know who the leaders are, you acknowledge the leadership and their role, and how that basically functions through the perpetuation of stories about them, tales about them. So, I'm not sure if this topic seemed obvious in some ways. Maybe not. I'm trying to, though, get at more of a sort of a lower level understanding here, digging a little deeper to show the long-term roots of the propaganda model and to show how that kind of subtle indoctrination underlies the basic functions of the state. From the time that states were first invented in Mesopotamia, around 5,000 years ago, all the way to the present. The state survives because people believe in it, because people believe in the authority of the ruler and the legitimacy of the ruler. And that belief is not natural. That belief is somehow not present in our very natures. That belief is consciously cultivated through a propaganda model. So, that's my discussion for today. If you enjoy these little talks, remember to pop down there and subscribe here on YouTube. Once again, this is Office Hours with the Mad Professor. I'm Liam, and I'll see you all next time.